Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing room where today I'm going to be making a shirt. That's right, I want to expand upon some of the things I was showing you in that other video, the shirt dress bodice video that I did recently here on the channel where I showed you how to do the convertible collar and the extension down the front, like the kind of button placket sort of detail for making a shirt dress bodice, but of course that needs to be sewn to a skirt and made into a dress hypothetically, and today I thought I would show you how to take those same sort of modifications and make them into a shirt or blouse pattern instead. I think today I want to do something with a yoke on the back and a little bit of gathering, something with a lot of ease in it, a lot of movement that I can either wear tucked in and it will look more fitted that way, or tie in the front like I like to do with a lot of shirts, things like that. So something with a bit more of a boxy and less fitted shape than you're used to seeing me do here on the channel. But I have a very fun fabric to use for this shirt today, so let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. Alright, here I am. I've got my little sketch beside me so I know what I'm doing, don't lose focus. And I have my bodice front of my basic bodice block pattern here, and I'm just going to go ahead and start by tracing this little guy. I guess last time I made a fold over shirt here I started with the all-in-one sleeve bodice block, but same general need for an overlap in button area and collar and stuff like that. So as I said, you could do that other modification with the regular bodice block, and that's what I'll be doing today. I'm going to go ahead and draw this dart, my darts in, I guess, here, although I will be ignoring my waist dart later, so you'll see that. Just refocusing the camera here. But I have this tracing of my front, and we can get started on making some modifications. I'm going to go ahead and square out from the waist at the side seam to the center front, like so. Kind of use that as my waistline guide. Then I'm going to square down an additional 8 inches from the center front just to make this longer. And of course, we're going to start interacting with the hips over here. So this is 8 inches longer in the front here. And then I'm going to lower my armhole a ½ inch here along the arm side. I'm just going to ease that in. My pattern book recommends a ½ inch down like this and then a ½ inch out. I'm just going to use a 1/4 inch out just because I don't like a ton of ease in my side seam, so I'm just adding on a 1/4 inch here all the way down to the waist, like so. So I've lowered that armhole a ½ inch, and then I've come out a 1/4 inch along the side seam there. Now down here, for the where the shirt extends past my waistline, of course I'm interacting with new measurements here because my hips will be down in here. So I need to make this come out a little bit to accommodate that. So I happen to know that my hips are like 44 inches, so I know that the bottom of this needs to be around 11 inches wide from the center front to the side seam, so that is what I'm keeping in mind here when I draw in this angle. And the angle along, or like the curve along the waist there, is still pretty subtle, which is good. But I'm just going to ignore this dart here, this waist dart. Normally we would sew this in, but we're gonna nope it. But this one on the side we are going to go ahead and keep, and you'll see what that results in for the fit. Basically, it just means that it's still fitted from the kind of bust up for this shirt, but then from the bust down, it is a lot looser. Now here along the center front, I'm going to add my overlap here for buttons. So I added on a ½ inch there for buttons, and then I'm adding on an additional 1.5 inches to become my new front placket. This placket I'm going to do on the outside of the shirt today. So this is completely different from how I did the button placket last time. It is still all in one like this. It's not a separate facing or anything, but I'm going to fold this onto the outside of the shirt, so you will see that later. Let me go ahead and start cutting this friend out here. There are, again, many different ways to make shirts, and collared shirts especially, and different ways to handle the overlap in the front. This is just another way to do it, just something a little different than I did last time. I'm just leaving that flap there in case I needed a little space. I'll show you in a moment. When I fold this front, what's going to happen now that I have this cut out. Alright, so this here, let's fold this along where the new center front will be. So I only have a ½ inch of actual overlap for my buttons to go past the center front there, but I think I'm going to actually fold this placket onto the front this time, which, depending on, you know, what your fabric, like if your fabric is the same on the front and back or how different it is on the back, this may or may not work. But my placket is going to finish like this, and I'll have a line of top stitching here, and then the buttons will be in the center there, and that is how I'm going to finish this placket today. So the inside of the fabric will show on the outside of the shirt with this little 1 inch placket here. So I just need my original ½ inch past the center front there for the buttons. Then I'm going to do an inch and then a ½ inch to hem that, kind of. And you'll see this when I sew this, so hopefully it will make more sense when we get to the sewing portion of this. But basically I just need an 1.5 inches in addition to the button excess, I guess. So it'll eventually, when it's all done, will be sewn and look like this, which means I can go ahead and trim this extra stuff off the top of the neckline as well. Goodbye, little friend. Snip. Like so. All right. And so up here, this will be folded in like that, and then the rest will be tucked into the collar. Again, you'll see that when we get to sewing it, but here is my shirt front here. My little button placket down the front of this. And I am actually going to do a small short stand collar on this, so you'll see that later as well. I did a stand collar, or sometimes called a priest collar or a mandarin collar, for my Luke Skywalker inspired dress here on the channel before, but I will do another one here today. But now that my shirt front is done, I can get started on the back. I'm going to give myself plenty of room here at the center back and just square off a line to start with before tracing my back bodice pattern on here. Again, I will trace this with the center back lined up on that line because I don't need seam allowance in the back because this will be cut on the fold eventually. And I will trace my dart only just so I can show you where it would be and then ignore it once again. So I'm going to nope this dart as well here in the back. So this again, I've drawn it in for you to see where it would be normally, but we're just going to ignore it. And again, I'm lowering the armhole a ½ inch in the back and just curving that into the arm side. And then I'm going to again come out that ½ inch along the side seam here. And then I'm going to square off my waistline again, like so. And I'm just going to take my front piece and line up where the side seam will match up when it's sewn, just to make sure that I have like a starting guide for how long this needs to be. But I'm going to need more width here in the back just because my back hip measurement is larger than my front hip measurement because I have a bum, that's right. So I'm just coming out another inch down there at the end of the side seam. And I'm just going to curve that in to a little bit of a longer hem here in the back, just because it's nice to have your shirt tails be a little bit longer, I suppose, or tail. Now up here, I'm just going to raise my back neckline a little bit because again, as always, as I always say, my back neckline on my bodice block is just too low for some reason. The card version has a lower neckline and I need to fix it someday, but next time I trace a card version, I'll fix it. I'm trying to decide how low I want my yoke to be back here in the back. You can have this be any shape you'd like. You can have it be straight across like this. You can have it be peaked. You can have it be scalloped if you want to, torture yourself a little bit while sewing. I'm just going to do this in a slightly shallow curve back here. So I'm just going to draw that in here. Of course, when I separate the top yoke piece from the bottom piece here, I'm going to have to add seam allowance between this because it's going to be, they will eventually be sewn back together. Here I am lazily and quickly labeling this, but this is going to need seam allowance and this is going to need seam allowance so that I can sew these two pieces back together. But before I do that, I'm going to add on a full 2 inches of extra down the center back of this for a total of 4 inches of extra ease back here that will be gathered in to the yoke. So the yoke remains the same as the bodice back would have been, so it'll fit again at the top of the shoulder. But back here in the back, I'm adding on a full 4 inches of ease down the center back that will be gathered in. And again, you will see that when we get to the sewing portion, or what that looks like when we get to the sewing and eventually modeling portion of this. And sorry about my voice being kind of strange today. We've had, again, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but we've had a lot of bad air quality here in Denver because of the amount of forest fires going on in the West and in California currently. So we're getting a lot of smoke here, just landing in Denver. So our air quality has been like high air quality alert for the past week and a half or so. And so, is my voice loving it? Are my lungs loving it? Probably not. Luckily, I don't go outside too much, but, how much can the air filter contend with? We're not sure. But now I have these pieces cut apart, I can go ahead and add seam allowance back on again along that yoke seam that I was talking about. So where we separate the yoke off, we need to add in seam allowance. You can do a yoke on the front of a shirt as well, if you would like to. And then you can even use the dart fullness on the front and shift it up into the yoke area and do gathering instead of a dart on the front, if you'd like to, which is done quite often. Looks like this when you do it that way, but simple enough to do. And then here I'm just going to again add seam allowance onto my back yoke, and like so, ½ inch of seam allowance on this piece as well. And you can do like embroidery on this yoke. You could do a contrasting yoke if you wanted to. Especially with shirts, it's kind of fun to get fancy with the details when doing like top stitching and stuff like that. Can be fun, especially if you use like a contrast colored thread or something. Alright, so now my back piece is here, and all of this extra in the main body of the back will be gathered into the yoke eventually. So I have these for my back, and now I just need to make a sleeve pattern. So let me grab my normal, like basic block sleeve here. This is a sleeve I've talked about here on the channel before, or you've seen me use it before, certainly. Let me just square off a line to use as the center for this. And I'm just going to take this and kind of draw a simplified, like wider version. I'm trying to fit this on here where I can have a little bit of space. Which way do I want to sketch this out? Trying to figure out. I just need to scoot it so I have space on the sides. I'll just have to tape in some more paper. Whatever, we'll make it work. I'll go ahead and trace this to start. This is just my basic sleeve. I know this sleeve fits into my bodice. Of course, I did lower my bodice armhole, that 1/2 inch on either side, and extend it by a 1/2 inch total. So I'm going to have to make this a little bit bigger as well, but less than you would think. You don't have to add, like if you add a 1/2 inch, if you come down a 1/2 inch on the armhole, you really only need to come out a 1/4 inch on the sleeve, just because the sleeve should already have some ease built into it. So I'm going to come out a 1/4 inch from the side here and then just square this off. So I'm adding some width to the sleeve as I do this as well. Same here on the other side, from the end of the sleeve cap kind of area, I'm just going to come out a 1/4 inch and then just square that down. Because I'm just squaring off these sides, I can now go ahead and just ignore the elbow dart that is normally in this sleeve, and I'll just make sure the sides are the same length, basically, is the plan here. So I'm just measuring this, making sure that my sides are the same length here, and I will just square off that to start with here, and then unfortunately my camera cut out. But after I squared off, you can see I drew this curved dip on the back half of the sleeve. This comes down about 2 inches. I just, there's no like special formula to get this curve. I just drew it on there, just based on how bishop sleeves and other billowy sleeves are done. Usually they dip a little bit in the back like this. It just gives it a little bit more of a piratey billowiness, poetic billowiness to the back of the sleeve. So I just drew on a 2-inch dip in the back and just curved that back up into where I had squared it off originally. Unfortunately, the camera had cut out for that part, but hopefully you can kind of see. Again, I didn't do any like mathematical formula to get this curve. I just eyeballed it and drew it on. Now, if you wanted your sleeves to be even more billowier, you know what I mean. You can separate this into fourths, like cut all the way up that center line, and then again on either side, and then add wedges of fullness, aka big, huge, almost darts. Open this up and swing the sleeve apart further. I think I show how to do this in my pirate peasant blouse tutorial, perhaps so. If so, I will put a card up to it here. Now I am going to eventually be cutting little slits in the back of the sleeve and finishing those with some tabs, but I will show you that when we get to it, because I had these little pieces that you can get the exact dimensions for them in a blog post. I will post in the description here. It's not a blog post by me, it's just the blog post I found to use to teach me how to do these little tabs, because not something I'm really familiar with. But I will go ahead and make a cuff pattern here for the end of the sleeve as well. I'm just going to measure my wrist here, about 6.5 inches around if I were to make a tight cuff. So I'll go ahead and trace a rectangle, 2 inches wide here, that is 6.5 inches long. So this is, exactly a cuff. I'm going to add 3/4 of an inch onto that for a bit of overlap for this cuff so that I can have a button and buttonhole to close it. And then I'm going to add seam allowance, so 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side and on the top and bottom, of course. This is going to be quite a narrow cuff. It'll be 1 inch wide when it's done because this will be folded in half. So just a narrow little inch cuff to contain the extra bit of ease in my sleeve here. These aren't going to be tremendously puffy sleeves, but they are minorly puffy at the cuff, which is nice. We all like a big billowy sleeve, don't we? These ones are on the smaller side of billowy, I suppose. So now I have a sleeve cuff pattern and my sleeve pattern, excellente. Again, I don't change the sleeve cap in any other way other than just coming out a 1/4 inch on either end there. I've just added a tiny bit more ease into the sleeve just because there was already some ease built into it. Now let's go ahead and draw our collar real fast. Again, I'm just going to square off. Here, I'm going to come out 3¼ inches and then 4¼ inches, which is the measurements from my neckline, just like how I was doing the collar in that other shirt video here. Only difference is I'm going to make it a small little stand collar instead of a fold over collar. So I'm just going to make this 1 inch wide here, like so. I'm just going to curve off this end here, like so. Just want a little curvy stand collar, and that's basically it. So instead of a fold over collar, I just make this little 1 inch wide tiny baby collar. So if you saw my collar video from a couple weeks ago, this is very similar to how to make the all-in-one roll collar. I can't remember what it's called. Off the top of my head today, is my brain working? Not sure. And now everything is hidden behind my head, but I'm just adding seam allowance onto that, and I will go ahead and cut this out. All right, collar piece done. I will cut that on the fold of my very fun fabric I'll be using for this today. It's kind of a homespun style, a little bit looser weave, cotton in all these different blends of colors, like all different striations of color here with a little bit of a Swiss dot, almost like polka dot pattern running through it. I did cut this so that the back yoke is like on the horizontal stripe like this, and the back of the shirt is on a vertical stripe, which is fun. Just playing around with stripes, even though these aren't like defined stripes. It's more just like kind of static print fabric. And it's all different colors up close, but kind of looks grayish green from far away. And this is a navy blue dot in here, so like the cross weave of this is a navy blue. So I'll be using navy blue thread on the shirt today. So all this is going to get gathered down into this back yoke. I'm going to set those aside for now over by the serger because I want to serge the raw edges of the side seams of the back pieces and the shoulder seams. So set that by the serger for now. And then of course on the fronts here we have this dart still. So I'm going to poke the dart indications through with my awl and transfer the dart markings onto my shirt fronts. That's what the inside of the fabric looks like. Basically it doesn't have its navy blue dots. Some kind of strange jacquard weave going on here to create that dot pattern in this fabric. It's rather fun. I did find this fabric on fabric.com, which I always say I try not to shop with, but they do have some unique fun things sometimes. And the reason I try not to shop with them much is because they are owned by Amazon, unfortunately. And so sometimes if I'm on fabric.com and I like a fabric a lot, I will try and find the name of the manufacturer, like if it's Robert Kaufman or something, and I will try and find it for sale on Etsy or somewhere else, just because, you know, it's best to support smaller businesses when possible in life. Especially like small quilt shops and such. If they have the fabric I need, I would rather support a smaller shop. That's just me though. I'm just cutting out a couple of strips of interfacing to use on these front plackets eventually too as well here. But until then, I'm just going to pinch and pin my darts and set these next to the machine so I can sew my darts in first, and then I will serge the side seams and shoulder seams and arm side of these pieces as well. I never serge the neckline or anywhere I'm going to hem, because I'm going to hem this by double turning it anyway. I don't need to serge that. And then the neckline is going to be encased in the collar, so I don't need to serge that either. Those raw edges will be encased in other ways, but anything that will be left raw on the inside or like open, I will go ahead and run through my serger real fast. I'm lucky to have one, but of course you could always use pinking shears or zigzag the edge of your things or use round seam binding or use French seams instead, which you really never see me do because French seams seems like twice the work to me. All right, here's my sleeve pieces, and eventually I'm going to have to do all kinds of stuff to that, but for now I'm just going to set them over again to be serged next to the serger as well. And here are my collar pieces. I'm going to cut a piece of interfacing and interface one side of this at least, just for a little bit more structure in my collar. So let me just grab my collar piece here and use some lightweight fusible interfacing. I'll just sew that, or press that onto one side of the collar, and I'll sew those collars together in a moment. But for now, let's go ahead and get started on these darts. Again, starting at the large end of the dart, using a small stitch length, stitching down my chalk line and then off the end of my dart, and then I will tie the dart shut. People are always asking me why I tie these shut. It's just because it was one of the methods they taught us in fashion school, and it was the method that I preferred most. So I still do it. It hasn't failed me yet, you know? Like so, and now sew the other dart, too. Only 2 darts for this project, which is nothing compared to some of my fitted dresses, of course. But this is going to be a much looser fit shirt. Much looser fit than most of the things you see me make. So I have my interfacing on this collar piece. I'm going to put those right sides together and stitch all along the sides and top edge of this, but I'm going to leave the last ½ inch of the lower edge free. Hopefully that makes sense. From down here, because that is what is going to allow me to sew this onto the shirt later. But I will sew around the top edge of this. I'm just going to pin it for now and set it next to the machine. So next time I sit at the machine, I'll go ahead and sew around the top edge of this. I have my interfacing pieces. Those are 1.5 inches wide. And I will put those onto my fronts here. First I'm going to press my darts. Now I'm going to actually put that interfacing, because this is going to turn from the inside out to be finished. I'm going to put that interfacing on the outside of my fabric, which feels like a weird thing to do, but it will be covered up in a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and iron press down this fusible interfacing onto the outside of my shirt front pieces, like so. And you can kind of see the color a little bit better of this fabric over here in the brighter light. Lighting down here in the basement is always a fun challenge because the light, for some reason, the light changes quite rapidly. I guess it's because I only have one window down here, and it is actually a north-facing window. But again, we're in a basement. Then I will go ahead and serge those edges I was talking about. So here I'm doing the arm side of the back yoke and across the back yoke here as well. But again, I'll just leave the neckline unserged, and I'll do all those side seams and side seams of the sleeves and such, just so that every raw edge is encased. But here I'm going to start pressing in my front button placket and buttonhole placket. So I'm first going to fold that over 1/2 inch. Grab my clapper here. Thank you. I can even grab the mega clapper. Thank you to the person who sent me these clappers, or people who sent me these clappers anonymously. I assume it's the same person, but I just don't really know. But thank you. And then I will fold this over an inch, like so. And now I have my front little placket area that will eventually be top stitched down, and then will receive its buttonholes and buttons later. Just external like this is a little bit of a fun accent. Makes it feel a little bit more, I don't know, rough and ready. I'm going to be wearing these shirts in a more rough and ready. I made this one, and I actually made a second one of these already, in a more rough and ready environment. But again, more about that coming soon. But just pin that in place. Eventually this will be top stitched on either side. You'll see that when we come to it, I did put a little snip in the top there to be able to fold this in on itself. Hopefully you caught that. Similar to how I did the front in my shirt dress bodice video as well. Just a little bit different, because instead of folding it in, I'm folding it on the outside. Now on the back here, I put my 2 lines of gathering stitching along the top of this back piece. And now you can see what's serged and what isn't. And I'll just gather this back piece down, kind of spread the gathering out, and then match it up with the back yoke. And pin everything in place once I have the gathering how I'd like it. I think actually the full 2 inches basically of the pattern piece, therefore 2 inches on either side when it's cut on the fold, so 4 inches of ease down the middle of this. It might be a little bit too much, honestly, ease in the back of this. I could probably get away with a little bit less, but that's all right. Gives me plenty of room to tie this shirt around my waist instead, which we all know how I like to wear a shirt tied. Just going to pin this all in place here, using my fine glass-headed pins that I have no fear of sewing over. But I will talk about later a few broken needles that were caused not by pins, but by my darn vintage 1948 buttonholer. But I'll talk about that when I get to it. But now I'm just going to stitch that down, stitch down the gathering of the back to the yoke back piece just to finish the back. These do go together almost quickly until you get to doing the shirt plackety tab things. And then suddenly they're tedious. That's kind of the... I mean, these shirts would go together so fast if you did the shirt's cuffs in some other way, I suppose. If you did like an elastic cuff on the end of these sleeves, your life would be a lot easier. But you'll see how I end up doing mine, which makes it take a lot more time. But here I'm just sewing around my collar, like I said, 1/2 inch seam allowance, of course. And again, stopping a 1/2 inch before the end on the fronts of these, just because I need room to attach this onto the shirt eventually, like so. All right, take my pins out of my back, and then I will press all the seam allowance up towards the yoke, and then I will top stitch on the yoke side all of this down into place, just because I think top stitching looks nice on shirts, personally. I'm just using, again, navy blue thread for this, and it blends in quite well. All the stitching, I do a lot of top stitching on this project, and yet it all just blends right into this multicolored fabric, so I'll never be able to see it. It's not the best demonstration fabric, this, because you can't see the stitching in it. It's a nice thing about making muslin demos is that I can use black thread on muslin or something like that, and you easily can see what I'm doing. Take my pins out of this collar as well, and then I will clip the curves of this, and then press my collar, and then again set it aside until I need it. This fabric is a little bit annoying because it's a looser weave. It's almost harder to cut. So cutting these little triangles out of the curves, it's kind of annoying, but just go along here, do a couple of clips over the shallow curves, and then clip some triangles out over the corners of this. You could, of course, do a sharp cornered stand collar as well. I just have mine a little bit curved for this shirt. I'll turn that, really hoping that these fires clear up here in the west, both because they're threatening structures and people, which is unfortunate and are causing a lot of destruction, but also because the smoke in the air is going to continue to be a problem for me on my upcoming mysterious adventures, so we'll see. Now that my fronts are prepared and my back is prepared, I can go ahead and sew the fronts and backs together down here along the side seams. So I'm just matching these up right sides together, and I will sew them together along the side seam and along the shoulder for both sides here. Sewing my shirt together. Again, these would go together so fast if they didn't have all the extra details. So I'm just sewing that with 1/2 inch seam allowance back here on the machine, of course. Again, a smaller, like medium to small size of stitch length on that. I always say it's 12 stitches per inch because that's what's on my machine. But I realize most machines aren't by stitches per inch anymore. But this old 1955, that seems to be the guide marker here. Stitching this side seam as well. Same on the other side of the shirt. And then I can go ahead and press those open. The side seam curve is so subtle that I'm not going to clip it. You know me, I always say, always clip your curves. and then but I break my own rules. So rules are meant to be broken, and alas, this one is such a shallow and I guess not sharp curve that I'm going to go ahead and leave it just as it is for the stability of having not clipped that, I guess. Again, I want this to be more of a rough and ready shirt, so it needs to be able to hold up over the side seam there. Just pressing my shoulder seams as well. And now I can go ahead and sew my collar on. So I'm going to match up the center back of my collar and the center back of my shirt. And then you can see the collar is almost straight and this is very curved. Depending on how loosely woven your fabric is, this will be more or less irritating. Luckily with this fabric, because it is so loosely woven, this was really easy to pin on. But I just used lots of little pins. And you don't need it to be smooth everywhere, you just need it to be smooth at that 1/2 inch point of seam allowance where the needle will go over this, you know? So you don't need to avoid wrinkles and pin tucks everywhere, you just need to avoid wrinkles right where the needle will put the stitch line. Hopefully that makes sense. This is again one of the more fiddly parts of shirt making or anything with a collar. This side I haven't put the notch in up here at the tab yet because I was like, is that how I'm going to do it? Is that how I'm going to do it? Yes. But I will go ahead and stitch this on. This is the first time I made a shirt like this, so I was kind of experimenting as I went here. Again, I have made another one of these since in a fun orange, yellow, and black fabric, which it's the same kind of like striated homespun looking stuff, so it doesn't look orange, yellow, and black unless you're very up close to it. But it's a very fun fabric. It looks kind of like dark mustard, yellowy, brownish, greenish from far away, which is a very technical color name, as you can tell. But here I am sewing my collar on. Again, that's just that single layer of the collar being sewn down to the shirt, and then the other side of the collar will be sewn down in a moment after I tuck all of this seam allowance up into it. And I will need to finally clip this corner here, stick everything up inside, up in here. So I'm just going to stick all my seam allowance up inside the collar, fold the edge of the collar down, and finish this off like so. And I'm going to use top stitching here to hold this area a little bit more secure. It would be a little bit fragile if you didn't stitch over it, but I'll show you how I kind of get around that by the pattern of top stitching I use for this collar and the fronts. But this is again very curved up here at the neckline, so I will be clipping this curve. You saw how curvy this small neckline is when I was pinning the collar on, so I will put clips into this about every 3/4 of an inch maybe. But then all of this seam allowance gets pressed up into the collar. Everything gets turned nicely and smoothly so that everything is finished off. And then you could stitch in the ditch on the other side to hold this collar down. You could come in here and slip stitch this shut by hand like I would like for a skirt waistband usually. But because I like doing top stitching on shirts, I just hold it down with top stitching. So you'll see that in a moment. I'm just pinning this all into place after I tuck the seam allowance up inside. And like I said, hopefully you can see what's going on here. Again, very similar to how I attached the collar to that shirt dress bodice I made here. That mock-up I made last time, we were doing this sort of thing. But just with a small stand collar today. The process is the same, the shape of the collar is different. Everything's all tucked up inside there and pinned in place. And I can take this over the machine and top stitch this all down, including the front little plackety bits as well. So I'm going to top stitch starting at the bottom of the center back of the collar here, where things aren't going to be seen much if I have a little bit of messier stitching back there where I start. I'm stitching all along just above the original line of stitching where the collar gets sewn onto the shirt itself. And when I get to the corner, I'm going to put the needle down, and then I'm going to sew diagonally down onto the placket itself, which gives that area a little bit more security. I'm even going to do a little back stitching there. And then I'm going to sew all down the front of the little button plackets that I folded onto the front here. Oh man, hopefully you can tell what I mean. It's hard to tell that even this is the back side of the fabric flipped onto the front, which just is how these plackets or front bits are finished. But I'm stitching using the presser foot as a guide for placement of that about a 1/4 inch down the placket, and then I will go ahead and stitch along the top of this to finish this off. So I'm going to come again back to this same corner up here at the top, stitch a little bit down from the top all the way out to the side, and then using the edge of my presser foot as a guide on this side, I will stitch again about a 1/4 inch away, just so I have top stitching on either side of this front little placket, and yet the collar is held on securely as well, and the little corner up there is secured by a little bit of thread. So this is just how I thought to do this, and I felt it worked out quite well for me. You could do it more top stitching, you could do less top stitching. This is just how I made this particular shirt, you know? Once again, with shirt making, it really is, there are just so many options, I guess. There really is optional, everything is optional when making shirts because there are so many different ways to finish things. But now I'm just going to come onto the other side and do the same thing, again starting at the center back end of the collar here along the neckline. You could stitch in the ditch here, but I'm stitching just a little bit up onto the collar. And then I'll leave the needle down, come across and stitch over this little corner here to give it a little bit more security, and then stitch down the sort of shirt side of my placket, all down the little 1-inch placket, just for some top stitching detail. If this was a solid color fabric and I was using a contrast thread, this would be very visible. Again, in this fabric, it kind of gets lost. Nothing like doing detailing that gets lost, which we talk about that now, but wait till you get to the shirt sleeve placket, which really, we don't see those. Again, finish the top stitching the same way, back in that corner, across the top of the placket, and then down the outer edge of the placket as well. Like so. Alright, so now we have a sleeveless shirt, basically. I mean, if you wanted to hem the arm size with some bias tape or something, then you would have a sleeveless shirt if you were into that kind of thing. But goodness knows I love sleeves. If you were to turn this back and wear it like an open collar, it would look kind of like this. Of course, if you do your top stitching even nicer than I do, then it will look really nice. But, alright, so now I am on the back side of the sleeve, or the inside of the sleeve. This is the reverse of my fabric. We start these tabs on the back side of the sleeve. Alright? Alright. The slit is cut 5 inches long. These little pieces are about 5.5 inches tall. This one I think is like 1 3/4 wide. Again, the blog post where I found a tutorial for how to do this, which is what I'm following exactly. I'm following that blog post's recipe for this, for the exact dimensions of these little pieces and of the slit and all that stuff is going to be linked in the description below. So go ahead and check out that post. This is not my invention, these little tabs. This is just how one person does it, and I'm copying them. So, but this gets sewn on 1/4 inch away from the slit here, and then 1/4 inch past where the slit ends, down here at the top of the slit. And again, this is all on the back side of the fabric, and this is the back side of the little tab doohickey too. I don't really know what to call these pieces. I'm sure there's technical names, because shirt making, because men wear shirts too, you may have noticed in life, has been around a long time. So there's a lot of, that's why there's so many options when it comes to shirt making, and so many ways to sew a shirt placket, for example. This is a 2-piece, and like a lot of times people cut the slit after these are sewn on, but this method uses the slit cut beforehand. You know, I found a blog post I like the look of. I tried it. It worked for me. Here we are. There's, again, a billion ways to do this. If you have a way that you prefer, use your way, you know? Once again, this is going to be 1/4 inch seam allowance, matching up. And I'm going to start in the corner of the last piece. And we're kind of creating a little window here around the slit on the back side, and then we'll turn these pieces onto the front and stitch them down. So you'll see all of that. So it'd be good to like read that blog post before or after watching me do this, so you can kind of get a better idea of what's going on. If you couldn't understand from just the blog post and the static photos they have over there, hopefully this will help. And if you don't know what the heck I'm doing here, don't worry, neither do I. But you can go ahead and check out that blog post. So we cut this into a little, we snip into each corner, and then on the front side of the shirt here, we can see our polka dots here. This is the front side of the sleeve. Press up that little triangle we cut, and then press these little funny, I don't know, window trimmings down. So this short side gets pressed with a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, and then we will layer this folded edge over the original stitching, like so. Again, if any of this is like hyper just confusing, go ahead and go read that person's blog post. They did a great job explaining. This is only my like 2nd or 3rd time ever making one of these little windows, so I'm no pro at it yet. Again, shirt making is something kind of new to me. We know I make a lot of dresses. So now this gets sewn down right along the edge here. So I'm just using my presser foot as a guide again, and just stitching this, you know, 1 millimeter away from the folded edge. Again, you could use like a decorative stitch if your machine does something like that. It might be a fun area to use like some sort of an embroidery stitch on these kind of little tabs. After you've done a few practice ones, perhaps, because they're complex enough without trying to get fancy, honestly. But after you do a couple, they do get a tiny bit faster, but this is the fiddly bit that takes forever, honestly. If you just, like, gathered this sleeve and, like, made a little casing along the edge and put elastic in it, kind of, again, like how I do in the peasant blouse, this would be a much faster situation. But this other side, again, gets pressed with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and, again, layered over the original line of stitching. This is just a little bit wider so that it covers the other side of the tab or the slit here. But again, I will just pin this down into place. It's also hard to see what's going on because this fabric is so busy. So it's not a good way to demo this. But you know, sometimes the fabrics I want to wear aren't the best fabrics for filming. So up here you can fold this just straight across if you want to, or you can fold it peaked like this, which is kind of the most traditional way of doing it. And I'll just press everything into place, grab that clapper, really press it down, and then we are going to stitch this part of it down too. And we do like a little house shape up here at the top. Again, all this is explained really well in that blog post I found, so go ahead and check it out. I found that blog post just by Googling how to sew shirt tabs. I'm sure it was like the 3rd or 4th result. And I found it worked for me, so this is the method I'll be sticking with for now. I see no reason to get fancy with my shirt tabs, just because I don't make a lot of shirts, as we know. Although that is changing. I'm making quite a few for my upcoming adventure. Like so. And I'm just going to actually, you can put an X through this, is what you see often, but I'm just going to actually stitch about a couple 1/8 of an inch away from the original line of stitching and just do a second little house shape inside of here. It's kind of like a little peaked roof, square house shape. You know what I mean. But again, if you wanted to do embroidery in there, it'd be really fun. But this is what that looks like when it's all finished. You have your little opening for your sleeve. Oh my goodness. So much work. It's like hours of work just to finish these darn sleeves. Sad. Now I'm going to go ahead and put gathering stitching along this hem of this. I'm just cutting off this little extra bit we don't need. But I'm going to put 2 lines of gathering stitching on this little short side over here. And I'll put 2 lines of gathering stitching all along the rest of the sleeve as well. And that's going to look like this. So I have all these thread tails now. But now that my gathering is in, it's easier to do it while it's flat like that. I will go ahead and sew my sleeve seams together. It's just easier to put the gathering in first, I think, while everything is still a bit flatter. And after that is sewn, I of course will press it open, like so. Then I'm going to put cuffs on the end of these sleeves. And actually for these cuffs, let's grab some fusible interfacing and interface these two, just for, again, a little bit of stability. So we'll just press that on here, trim any excess off. At least these cuffs, I thought to cut them on the horizontal stripe like this to match up with the vertical stripe of the sleeve. It's nice, again, to set stripes against one another, or even if you want to cut them on the bias and things like that. But again, this isn't a traditional polka dot or stripe here. It's kind of a mix of both, and then again, a little bit loosely woven homespun-ish kind of effect with this gradiated, striated thread. Reminds me of like when you knit stuff with that like kind of tie-dye yarn, it comes out looking a little bit like this. Kind of what this reminds me of. Although I cannot knit, sadly. I wish, because there's a lot of vintage sweaters I would love to have, but I fail at knitting. I can knit like a plain or a cable knit scarf, but once you start getting into like, knitting to me is much more math than sewing is. Because knitting you have to like remember the number of stitches, the type of stitch, and following those patterns feels a lot more like math to me, so I am not a good knitter. I've tried a couple of times, thought I would give it another go, and I always end up kind of regretting buying more yarn. But now I have all my gathering in here, so I'm just going to tie off one side and then gather this sleeve down to the size of my cuff, essentially. Just gathering this down. Again, 2 lines of gathering stitching really makes this so much easier. I highly recommend using 2 rows of gathering stitching, unless you have like a gathering foot or something that you really rely upon. But once that's down to a correct-ish size, I can start pinning it to my cuffs here. You can see I just pressed the seam allowance of the cuff, so I would know exactly where to put this. I find that an easy way to do this. But then I'll just space my gathers out, make sure everything's gathered to the right size, that nothing's kind of bunched up too much in one area and not in another. And pin this all down to my cuff, again using my nice fine pins that I like using. And once everything is kind of finalized, I will tie off the other end of the gathering too, so I can just scooch these around. Like so. And then pin them in place. You can also like pleat these if you want. Of course, the shirt, because I went ahead and straightened off the sides, the shirt is a little bit wider down here at the cuff than the standard sleeve would be if you just use the sleeve without modifying it in any way. But well, again, I like a big sleeve, so I added a little bit of extra down here. Go ahead and stitch these onto the cuffs with 1/2 inch seam allowance, as always. Probably should have done this with the gathering facing the feed dogs, but you know, oh well. Like so. Take my pins out, cut off all my extra thread tails now that I definitely don't need them. Goodbye. And then once again, this is kind of done the same way as the collar in some ways. The seam allowance gets encased in the cuff itself. So I'll just press down this top edge with the 1/2 inch seam allowance, press in my sides, and then fold everything all inside to cover all the nasty business. We don't need to see any of that. And again, I'm going to hold this down, not by slip stitching it, not by felling it, which you could, but by top stitching it from the outside all around the edge of the cuff to hold everything in place. So once again, just back here on the machine using my small end of my presser foot as a guide for the spacing of the top stitching all along the end of the cuff and along the top where it meets the sleeve to hold everything down inside. Again, something that could be fun to use a contrast thread or an embroidery stitch if you have such stitches on your machine. Again, my machine does 1 stitch, just a straight stitch, because she's an old gal. But it's all I use 99% of the time anyway. So now my cuffs are all finished on my sleeves. I just need to do a buttonhole and button on these later when I'm doing all my buttonholes. But the tops of these sleeves, even though they're not going to have a puff sleeve, I do put 1 line of gathering stitching in. This is the only time I ever use 1 line of gathering stitching, to just put a tiny bit of gathering in the top of this. You're not actually gathering them down, you're just making it so it curves under this tiny little bit over your sleeve cap. Because again, usually a tiny bit of ease is built into the way the sleeve pattern is drafted. And then I just match up my underarm seams to my side seams here, always pinning those areas first, and then I try and match the center front of the sleeve cap with the center front, or the shoulder seam, but you don't see me do that here. Playing it loosey-goosey here, but these actually fit in quite well, so I just go ahead and pin everything around and set in my sleeve here. And even though, you know, you would think that the sleeve might be a little bit too small after that lowering and widening of the armhole on the bodice, you have to do it quite a bit further for the sleeve to stop matching up, weirdly enough. Just because usually enough ease is built into the sleeve cap that problems don't arise, honestly. I'm just pinning that buddy in place, like so. You can see I use lots of pins. Some people use no pins. I'm just not one of those people. I use lots of pins and I sew over them. But you know, the clothes get made, so what are you gonna do? But I will go ahead and, again, 1/2 inch seam allowance, stitch my sleeves onto my shirt. And you know, at this point I'm thinking, home stretch, because the shirt is almost done. It just needs to be hemmed and buttonholes after this. So honestly, making the sleeves is the fiddly part of this because of that sleeve tab and the cuffs and stuff. Hopefully the more I do it, the faster I will get at it. Again, I don't have a lot of practice, so this is my, you know, 3rd and 4th sleeve tab I've ever sewn. All right, and here's my sleeve all set in. No puckering. Ready to go. Nice. Although a little bit covered in lint. But what are you going to do? This is the sewing room. Now for the hem of my shirt here, I'm just going to go ahead and turn this twice, about 1/8 of an inch, and 1/8 of an inch again, and just hem this down onto the inside here. This is the inside of the shirt. I mean, you could hem it on the outside if you wanted to. Kind of makes sense with the external, like, button placket to hem it almost on the outside. But I'm just going to do like a little narrow hem on this, press that into place, take it over the machine, and stitch that down. I don't mind having visible stitching on my hem on this because A, it's going to be tucked in all the dang time, and B, I have top stitching everywhere else on this shirt, so might as well have a visible hem as well. Saves me time not having to hand hem it, that's for sure. And then here, I'm just deciding where I want my buttons to be. I'm using little mother of pearl buttons for this today, some sort of like smoke gray ones. I've spaced these about 3 inches apart. On some shirts, I have noticed that the top button is horizontal and the rest are vertical. Just looking at some of the shirts in my wardrobe that I've bought thrifting over the years. This one is from Pendleton. This one is a collar with a collar stand, which I think is what this is most traditionally used for, where you do the horizontal button at the front top and then do vertical buttons for the rest of it. But it does seem most of the time for shirts that the buttons are vertical. It seems to me that like small shirt buttons usually have vertical buttons, and like the bigger, more decorative a button is, the more likely it is to be a horizontal button. I don't really know the rules on this, but here I am installing my 1948 Sanger buttonholer onto the 99K, and here's the part that I've been having trouble with lately. This little needle plate cover covers up the feed dogs so this machine will work, and getting this screw super tight is very important because I keep, for a while there, I kept having this needle plate would shift just a little bit on me so that the needle wouldn't go through the hole, it would hit the plate. And so I kept having needles break and hit me. So now I wear safety goggles when I do these buttonholes, just because I don't trust this button plate. As much as I try and tighten that screw on there, I try and get it as big as I can. You see I went and grabbed a normal screwdriver to get on there. Because as much as I tighten this guy down, every once in a while it moves on me and the needle shatters. So now I wear safety goggles. The safety first people will be happy to hear. So this little pronged bit at the top of this buttonholer hooks onto the needle screw, and then the rest of the machine hooks onto the presser foot like lever. And this just gets put on like a very giant presser foot, honestly. So that's kind of how the buttonholer gets fitted onto the machine. The buttonholer itself, while mechanical, doesn't have any like energy source. In the back of this, you put in the little templates for what size buttonhole you want. So I had forgotten to switch that out, putting in my 1/2" one there. Again, this little fork fits onto the needle screw, and then the other side gets screwed on like a presser foot. The biggest presser foot ever. And my safety goggles nearby, and then a piece of scrap fabric to test this on, just to make sure everything is going to be fine. And I'll position this where I want my test buttonhole to be. And you kind of twist it up to the front, and then once you press the pedal, this machine, the separate little like presser foot machine, gets run by the like machine raising and lowering the needle, and it just moves everything where it needs to be for this straight stitch machine to make a buttonhole. It's just magic. I honestly, I could try and explain how it works, but I do not know. As far as I can tell, some mechanical magic is just happening here. So it sews a button. I usually go around 3 times for a really nice finished buttonhole. Open those up, and Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your aunt. Is this an American phrase or an English phrase? I don't know where that phrase comes from, but it doesn't seem like that's something I would say in England. Alright, now I can start doing my buttonholes on my actual shirt itself. I'm going to start with the ones on the shirt cuffs, and then I will do 6 down the front of my shirt itself. And after that, this shirt will be all finished and ready to wear. But now I'm wearing my safety goggles every time I do buttonholes over here because I just don't want the needles. It's like I broke one because the needle plate had moved, and I tightened it down a little bit more, and I tried again, and it broke another needle, and then it broke 3. I think this machine has broken like 6 needles on me now because of the needle plate moving. And like ever since I started tightening it down, like putting my back into it, it has been fine. But that was the lesson there, is that you have to tighten that screw on that needle plate cover real hardcore if you want to be able to do this safely. And here is my finished shirt all done up, buttoned completely up and tucked in for the most prim of looks. But of course this can be unbuttoned at the top of the collar, the sleeves could be rolled up, the shirt could be tied or left untucked. There's a lot of different styling options when it comes to a boxier shirt like this one. I'm looking forward to wearing this with both skirts and some of the more adventure-ready trouser styles I've been making lately. Off camera, I haven't been sharing those with you, but you will be seeing them in due time, I promise. All will be revealed eventually. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this shirt pattern came together today, and if you want me to try out any different kinds of collars or shirt details, like maybe we could do a collar with a stand sometime, or different sleeve styles, things like that, let me know what you would like to see from me. Not just shirting details, but anything that you'd like to see me try and pattern draft or sew in the future. Always feel free to leave me suggestions like that in the comments, and I will hope to incorporate them into the schedule somehow, although we may be straying into a little bit more costuming here as fall and the Halloween season begins. Thank you as always for watching today, and I'll be back here with more vintage fashion, sewing, and pattern drafting, of course, real soon. Bye!